Thank you very much indeed, Brian, and Minister, fellow friends. It's wonderful to be back at UCD. It's wonderful to be at the Garret FitzGerald School, because I look forward tomorrow, I must say, to the many discussions we'll have. But it's a particularly great pleasure for me to be at the Garret FitzGerald School, if you know what I mean, because he meant a great deal to me, as he meant a great deal to, I guess, many of us in this audience, and some, of course, were very close to Garret. I knew him, if I may just begin with recollection. I got to know him very shortly after I joined the staff of UCD, which was in 1968, September 68. And as I'm sure the historians will know, in March of 69, I guess, this gentle revolution occurred, as it came to be known. And Garret, who was absolutely wonderful, I mean, we were mainly a group of young hotheads like Rory Quinn and myself. But on the staff side, it was actually mainly the students who were truly the leaders of the movement. And it was a very, very sensible movement. I must say, looking back on the documents of those days, we were looking for nothing more than the merest common sense, I would say, in university administration. But Garret, who was just absolutely extraordinary, he was at the time also a TD, but he was so supportive and very much part of that, though it cost him a lot in terms of time. And it certainly didn't earn him a lot in terms of kudos. I mean, it wasn't exactly the thing to do for a minister, for a member of parliament, for a TD, to actually take part with to be part of the riffraff of the student sort of movement of those days, and of the sort of younger members of staff, like, as I say, Minister Quinn and myself. There are many other things come to mind about Garret. Let me just mention one, because he was such an extraordinary man. Dennis Turner, who was one of those younger faculty of those days, those younger staff, he went on to be Professor of Theology in Yale. He's just retired, actually, from that post. But Dennis and I, and perhaps, I actually don't remember if Rory was involved in this, forgive me, Minister, but I know we had this project, which was to design a system under which every incoming undergraduate would have a staff mentor. It was just, you know, it was the sort of thing, you know, young staff do, you know, they haven't families, they haven't a lot of public commitments and so on. And so we buried ourselves, and a number of us, Dennis and I remember in particular, you know, drawing up these charts of students, and it was boring work, but Garret heard that we were doing this, and he was with us every evening for the 5 or 6 evenings, you know, long evenings to 10 at night that it took to do it. You know, when it took him away from family, it took him away from the Dáil. It didn't earn a single point, so to speak, a brownie point or a kudos point, because no one knew he was doing it anyhow. But it was just typical of him. He was always such a wonderful, wonderful commitment to public service, you know, and it didn't have to be in the public eye. He was just as committed when it was not at all in the public eye as that particular exercise was not in the public eye. I'm sure there'll be many other recollections of that wonderful man in the course of the next day or so, but I better end mine there and begin to earn my keep. I'm delighted to be giving this lecture. I hope it'll connect with the themes of tomorrow in some way. Of course, I'm a philosopher, so it'll be undoubtedly much more abstract than almost anybody would like it to be. But I think it connects. I think that the approach that I deeply committed to connects with the themes tomorrow. And so I'm maybe not full of hope, but I'm not full of despair either, that some of these themes will link with the themes tomorrow. So let me just begin with the question, what is democracy? Now, it's a typical philosopher's question, isn't it? But it's really, I think, important to think about that question as an abstract question, not just to assume we know what democracy is, it's just you got elections and stuff, and then to wonder, well, what's good about democracy? It seems to me, I mean, that's one approach and worthwhile in many contexts, but I prefer so to speak, a coming down on the topic approach. So let's just think about, assume democracy, as most of us take it to be, is an ideal in the organization of our social and political and economic life. So how should we think about that ideal? What exactly does it involve? Well, now, I think actually the etymology is very helpful here. Demos means people, of course, as we all know. Kratos means power or control. And essentially the ideal of democracy isn't it really, this isn't telling you anything, is the ideal of the people, the demos, exercising control, in particular, and this was there from the very earliest Athenian days, as you might say, in particular the people exercising control on an equal basis, in a manner such that each of them has got an equal stake. They exercise, as you might say, equally shared control over what happens in their society, over what happens in their politics, and so on. I mean, another way of putting that is just simply that on the image of democracy is of a polity run in such a way that it is, well, just the people's business. It's the people who rule themselves. It's the people who dictate what happens. It's the people who impress their shape, the desire, so to speak, on the pattern of public policy making. Of course, that notion that government is on the people's terms, that government or politics is the people's business, is just in Latin the notion that the polity, the public, the state is a res publica. It's a public affair. That's all it means. So I think of this, and I'll be approaching this from within a broad tradition that I think of as a Republican, or some people say a neo-Republican way of thinking about these themes. Okay, so let's agree, as I hope you will agree, that democracy means equally shared control by the people over how the business of politics, the public business, is done in the society. So then let's ask, this is a real philosopher's way, I suppose, of approaching it, but I think it makes sense. Let's ask, what exactly does control mean? It's very easy to pass over that word too quickly, you know, and so say, well, we all know what control means. Actually, I'm not sure we always do, because in many of the writings on democratic theory, the word control is used for what I call influence. Influence is not control. That's the main point I want to hit on to this question, so to speak. The question as to what popular control requires. There is a handout if any of you want to, and I'm following pretty well the points are on the handout. So let me give you an example. It's a silly little example. I use it in the book that is kindly on sale outside the door. Imagine that you go to a busy intersection, a traffic intersection, and you get up there and you pretend you're a traffic police officer. There are lights there, but you sort of override them, you start waving the traffic, you stop others and so on. You can imagine what will happen. Well, one question is, do you influence the traffic? Well, almost certainly you will. Some will obey you, some won't obey you, others will scream at you, people will blow their horns, you'll have a hell of an influence on the traffic. But will you control the traffic? Well, obviously not, because while you influence it, you don't exercise that influence to any, so to speak, predetermined or designed or welcomed effect. You push, so to speak, what's happening, but you don't push it in any particular direction. Now, in order to have control, I would say, you've got to have influence plus direction. You've got to be able, if you're controlling a process, and this is true across the board, you have to influence the process, of course. You've got to make a difference to how the process goes, but you've got to make a difference that pushes in a direction in which is where you want it to go, or at least you welcome it going. So control means influence plus direction. And now with that sort of very simple bit of philosophical analysis, what does popular control mean, or equally shared popular control? Well, it's bound to mean that, first of all, the people act together as a whole, so to speak, in exercising this influence. And it has to be that the influence they exercise is accessible to each of them equally. They are in a position equally to access, to have an entry on that system of influence, to play a part. It's equally accessible to them in that system of influence. But more than that, this jointly exercised influence, accessible to all, has to push government and public policy in a direction that is equally acceptable to all. Otherwise, you don't get equally shared control. If you're really going to get something worth describing as people equally sharing and controlling politics, it's got to be the case that they can all equally access the system of influence you have, and that this system of influence serves to deliver a result that is acceptable to all of them. It's a very high ideal, that, and it looks on the face of it totally unrealistic, doesn't it? I mean, how could you possibly, you might ask, have a system in which people all participate in it in some way? It's equally accessible to all to have an influence, to play their part in that system of influence, and it pushes things in a direction that is equally acceptable to all of them. Okay, I actually think it's much more realistic than it sounds when you describe it that way. And I think many people in political science back off that ideal because it seems too unrealistic. We want something that, so to speak, is down to earth and feasible. So let me just, I'm going to now, in the remainder of the talk, I'm just going to ask, well, firstly, very briefly, what would it be for the people to act together in exercising influence in a particular direction? Then I'm going to ask, well, what institutions would approximate giving people equal access to influence? What institutions might deliver that result? And then I'm going to ask, finally, could such a system of influence, could such a system of institutions ever be thought to deliver a result that is equally acceptable to all, so that you can then think of the people as exercising equally shared control? Now, in the institutions I'm going to describe, of course, they're going to match in a good part the existing institutions with which you're all familiar. In some part, in good part, main part perhaps. And that's not surprising after all. I mean, if I came up with a scheme for how we govern ourselves that's totally unknown and unrecognizable, well, it would scarcely be very credible in all likelihood. But it is at the same time an ideal, though I think you'll find it obviously familiar from the institutions we know, it's still an ideal, I think, that pushes for lots of reforms and that helps categorize and taxonomize the sort of reforms we should be continually working for in a democracy. So first of all, the quick question, what is needed for it to be true that people act together in influencing what happens in government? Well, one way in which they might act together to influence government would, of course, be if you had a participatory sort of democracy. That was never, ever a realized ideal of a democracy. If you look at Athens, for example, we were often told, misinformed actually, in being told that the Athenian ecclesia, which had all citizens in it, they were all male, of course. Citizenry up to very recently has been incredibly restricted, but they were a lot of the males, it's true. But we were told that that ecclesia, all the people together, they made the law, they governed themselves. Actually, they didn't. The Athenian assembly was under severe restrictions as to what it could do. In fact, if you tried to pass a law in the assembly, you are likely to get into a lot of trouble, because even if the law was passed by a majority and someone took it to the court that you had brought in a change in the law, whether explicitly or not, then you could be up for a very serious charge indeed. And the courts, of course, were also popular assemblies. They weren't like the courts we know. So the ecclesia did not make law. That's a very important thing to recognize. So that wasn't the Athenian ideal of democracy either. The notion that democracy would involve everybody together making up their minds, that actually was a notion of democracy invented by the enemies of democracy. Jean Baudin in the 16th century, Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, they all told us, what's democracy? Well, it's everybody coming together in assembly and voting on all the laws. The only one who came close to identifying something like that as democracy was Rousseau. But even Rousseau, of course, didn't call it democracy, and he had restrictions too. That's another theme, and maybe it'll come up in Q&A. I think the notion of the people acting together would be realized by a participatory assembly, but no one ever really thought, even in small societies, that that was a realistic lawmaking ideal. The people acting together, I think, much more naturally goes with an electoral system of the kind that we have in all the known democracies. That's the first prerequisite, and that's dead right. Because it's only when you get people doing things, like voting, for example, in the knowledge that other people are involved in the same activity, and that each is involved in this activity only because of knowing that this is the way in which we together have one particular sort of contribution to a system of public influence, that's the only way in which you can make it the case that the people can be said to act together. So, for example, we're often told, it's quite right, that people in a, say, perfectly competitive market, they control, we're told, the prices at which goods are sold. And if everyone looks to buy a given commodity at the cheapest price, the price keeps falling to the competitive level, where if you go lower, you go out of business, and we're told that thereby people control the price in a competitive market. Yes, but they don't control it together. They don't take an action together, so to speak, which is a case of they're together controlling the price. It just happens they each individually seek something, buy low, sell high, and by each individually seeking that, the aggregate effect is that prices are kept at a certain level. In order to have anything like democratic influence, you've got to have the people acting together, not in that, so to speak, isolated manner of people in the market. They've got to be doing something together, and elections are they're the first, so to speak, element you've got to have. That's point one, and that's scarcely big news, is it? Okay, so let's go on to the other question. So in order to have a system under which people act together in exercising influence and control, you certainly do have to have elections. Now, next question I want to ask is, given we have elections, let's suppose we elect those to office, at least many of those who hold office, to office, is that in itself going to give us equal access to influence? Well, of course, it does give people access to a certain sort of influence, because politicians in general are very responsive to the swathes of opinion and so on within the electorate. But the striking thing, of course, and everybody knows this, we call it the tyranny of the majority, or the danger of the tyranny of the majority, of an elective despotism, is that an electoral system has lots of inbuilt problems, which means that even when you've got it, even if it's working very well, it's very unlikely to represent a system of equally accessible influence. And now I want to just mention three problems, and there are others, but these three problems are problems for the electoral system being a system of accessible, equally accessible influence. Okay, so I'm going to give names to them. I call the first the sticky majority problem, the second the party interest problem, and the third the influential lobby problem. They're all pretty familiar to you, but they're worth, I think, putting in on the table together and seeing where they point us. So let me very briefly look through each of these. So the first, the sticky majority problem. If there were elections, and in particular, if there were perhaps with referenda spread among the elections, because that's certainly consistent with the electoral system, this might be fine, you would say, if majorities rotated randomly. So, for example, if in an electoral system you could say of any individual, picking an individual at random, that person had the same chance as anybody else of being on the winning side. Now, I think if that was really true of an electoral system, that everyone picked at random had the same chance as everyone else, ex ante, of being on the winning side on any issue, then you sort of feel, well, everyone's getting a fair crack of the whip. You know, that's a very Australian expression, sorry. I carry the history of my own affiliations with me. Everybody gets a fair shake, as it's often called. Everybody would get a fair shake if indeed they had an equal chance of being on the winning side. I think we all agree with that. But now here's the striking thing. These problems all mean that not everyone has the same chance of being on the winning side under most electoral systems, unless they are built up with other systems that surround them, check them, balance them, and expand them in various ways. So just to look at this first problem, the sticky majority problem. Sticky majority is the fact that on many issues, of course, there are divisions in society such that there are people in some of those sections of society, in some of those sectors, where on certain issues, they'll never be on the winning side. So if you have a vote about everything, so to speak, or if everything is up for a decision by those we elect in a parliamentary system, there are going to be some people, those in these, so to speak, fixed or sticky minorities now, who are going to be left out. So, for example, if you allow a vote on whether to establish a religion as the national religion, for example, giving it a special place in civic life, etc., clearly there are going to be people in minority religions who are going to be left out on that. They're not going to be any related decisions. They're going to be stuck in the minority. They're going to be stuck on the losing side. So in order to make sure that everyone within a society, and let's assume we don't have an issue about who the citizenry are, we have an inclusive notion of the citizenry, in order to make sure that everyone does get a fair shake, that everyone has an equal chance of being on the winning side, you've got to do something about these issues that, so to speak, necessarily push some people onto the margins out of the system of influence altogether. There are many different things you can do. I mean, one is, for example, to this is the most extreme measure, and obviously in some cases pretty reasonable, which is you take the issue out of the realm of majoritarian decision-making altogether. You have a constitution, in other words, that sets up something, say, like freedom of religion as a constitutional requirement such that the Parliament, not even the people in a referendum as a whole, are entitled, except if you have a system, which you will have, a constitutional revision that allows it, but in general, no majority can just override that. It's a sort of fixed part of the arrangement. Now notice, the very important thing from my point of view is that that requirement that some issues are taken off the majoritarian agenda is actually a requirement that's needed in order to give people equal access to popular control. It's not a requirement that, so to speak, hinders or restricts popular control. It's actually required for people to have equal access to popular control. If you don't have it, what you have is a majority on certain issues just simply pushing people out of the system without the same access to influence as others have. Now, of course, the divisions in question need not be just religious. They may cut across ethnicity issues, across sexuality issues, across issues of sexual orientation, for example. I would say that on a whole raft of issues, we're all familiar with them, it is a democratic prerequisite that these issues are, if not actually taken off the agenda, the majoritarian agenda, at least such that they can only be changed by, say, a supermajoritarian requirement, or such that they can only be changed through a long process that involves different sort of bodies being involved. And in particular, you have to have a society where people in those minorities are in a position to speak up without fear, so to speak, for their point of view, to try to persuade others that they're not getting a fair shake if this, that, or the other issue is left on the majoritarian agenda. So that's the first problem I call the sticky majority problem. What it argues for is that, I just have them here in the handout, see, certain sorts of immunities, for example, that the majority should not on certain issues be able to affect individuals at all, because on those issues there are important sticky majorities. There have to be powers of free speech, association, contestation, whereby majorities can make their case in the system and try to persuade a majority to either take something off the majoritarian agenda or to run it through a different sort of process. And of course there are, we know them, processes like bicameralism, for example, which properly understood, where you've got two different houses of parliament, but representing often a different base, or representing them in a different way. It can lead for a sort of check and a discussion and a slowing down and a chance to make sure that those in these minorities are going to not be locked out into minorities, that they too can feel of themselves as others can, that we belong to a system in which we can equally access the sort of influence, the system of influence over how policy goes. That's one problem. The second problem, I call it here, is the party interest problem. This is a fairly obvious one, and Ireland is in a much better position, I suspect, than, for example, America. We know that if you've got a system under which a party, a group of people gain, which is perfectly right if you're going to have proper government, gain control over the parliament, that there's always a temptation for those people, once they're in power, to vote not in the public interest, not, so to speak, pushing an agenda in which everyone has a stake, but rather to push party interest, in particular party interest. And of course, if those in power push a party interest, they're giving priority, in other words, to the influence, therefore, of those committed to the party, they're going to be cutting out other people in general. So, I mean, it's easy to pick examples from other countries, but take districting in the United States. As many of you probably know, districts are actually drawn by the party in power in the local state, in most states. And of course, as you'd expect, what the parties do, they keep changing the boundaries and playing them around. I mean, Texas increased its Republican representation by, what was it, 5 or 6 or something in the last election, purely by dint of changing the districts. I mean, it came to a point where the Democratic members of the Republican legislature, in Texas, actually left the state so that there wouldn't be a quorum in the Texas Assembly that could pass these district boundary changes that would greatly favor the Republican Party, not just in Texas elections, but in federal elections. So they went to South Dakota or somewhere. They were forcibly brought back and planted in the chamber in order to be there, to vote against, so there would be a quorum. I mean, that's an extreme example. So clearly, if you're going to have democracy, you can't leave the drawing of district boundaries to the people who are actually elected, because they've got such a private interest in drawing the boundaries to suit themselves, in which case you wouldn't have equal access on the part of people as a whole on that major issue of policy and the other policy issues that, of course, ramify out from it. So what you clearly need is what we have, happily, though it came about only in the course of my lifetime in Ireland, is an electoral commission that works at arm's length from Parliament. Now, I don't know how well the Electoral Commission is thought to work in Ireland, and I don't want to get embroiled in any controversies on that issue, at least if I am. I plead ignorance. I'm not really informed on that matter. But in general, electoral commissions work extremely well, and I know that probably the Irish one does too, where you've got a degree of community representation, you've got people with a professional involvement, you've got an arm's length control from Parliament, you've got, of course, the press keeping an eye on how they operate, and the public keeping an eye on how they operate. And so you get a commitment in the members of such a commission to draw boundaries that answer to a brief that they've been given, and to answer to various criteria that people in general would support when it comes to district boundary. So see what's happened there again is you've taken an issue off the majoritarian agenda. You've not taken it away from those we elect to govern us, but you do that in order precisely to give the people equal access to control over a whole raft of issues. If you leave it to the very people we elect to do it, then clearly they're not going to, well, if they're human at any rate, and subject to the normal pressures of corruption, well, it's not really corrupt, distortion, let's call it, then they're obviously going to bend those boundaries in their own interest. That's one example. Another example, I think myself, is interest rate policy. I mean, when that was left in the hands of the elected representatives, they're under fantastic pressure to respond to local demand, for keeping interest rates down and so on, which longer term may be economically disastrous. So the move that you've had in most systems, I know this is a much more controversial thing to say, to having a central bank, to having a bank that is independent at arm's length at any rate from the elected government, is again a way of taking an issue away from those we elect to govern us, because they've got too much of an invested interest in a particular line. In other words, to keep happy the people immediately who've elected them or supported them or whatever. You've got to keep that pressure away. Of course, most people elected to government will welcome that sort of restriction and will recognize that it actually makes for, if you left it to those elected, they would govern in the interests of those immediately pressuring them. You would not get a system under which actually it's a system of equal influence, because you would thereby, in effect, disenfranchise those who are not, do not have an interest in the policy to which government is being pressed. Much better keep it at arm's length. Everyone can get a fair shake, so to speak, of influence under that system. Let me be more controversial still. I actually think that in many democracies today, criminal justice policy, sentencing policy, when left to the people we elect, are often made absurdly tough. I mean, this again is true most obviously in America, but it's a worldwide trend of rising, penalties for crime, longer and longer stretches of incarceration, and so on. Now you can see what happens when people who have been elected are in charge of sentencing policy. Some horrible act occurs, crime occurs, and they'll always occur. You get an immediate outcry from people about this, and how does an elected representative respond? They can only say something like, we're going to be really tough on crime. I mean, if they say, well, if you look at the statistics and the longer term and so on, they're going to be lost. We all know that. That's really bad politics. So you've got to save, I would say, sentencing policy from the effect of electoral politics as well, in order actually to give people equal influence over what happens in public life, by slowing it down, by having, I would say, a sentencing policy commission at arm's length from government that can, so when the horrible crime occurs, those elected can say, well, I'm outraged about this and I'll be writing to the commission, but we mustn't, for example, press them because they're not elected. They might represent the community on a community movements, for example. They might represent professionals, lawyers, they might represent judges, they might even have politicians amongst them, but essentially they wouldn't be elected, and so the politician could say, look, we shouldn't pressure these people, but I am going to write to them, you all should, and put your point of view. And that commission comes back 6 months or a year later, whatever, with proposals about sentencing policy, but it can be much cooler. You know, the heat has sort of gone out of it. That actually gives people a much better chance of having an equal system of influence on, over the longer term, on what happens in public policy. Third problem I mentioned is the most obvious of all, probably, is the influential lobby policy. I mean, problem. And this is clearly the problem, that when you elect people to govern us, they have to depend on good publicity, and they have to depend on financial contributions to help them win election. Now, I will tell, I just reminded of a story that came up with Garret many years ago, which I mean, it said a lot about him. He's wonderful, sort of transparent candor, you know, but also absolute honesty. I actually edited this book called The Gentle Revolution that captured the thoughts of we immature young members of staff and the radical students in the group as well. A small press in Dublin called Sceptre Press at the time were publishing it, and I was going back and forth from Earlsfort Terrace to where their headquarters was, and they said they were going to do a montage with Brian Lenihan, who was the Minister of Education, so to speak, in the centerpiece, and he was sort of the target, you know. So they did this. I thought it sounded a great idea, and so on. And they came back to me and said, look, we got a terrific cover. Just have a look at it, you know. And there's this cover of all these faces and so on. And then right in the middle, where I expected to find Brian Lenihan, I find Garret FitzGerald. Garret's face, I think the compositor or whatever, actually was a bit unclear about the identity of different politicians, but he put Garret in where he should have put Brian. And I remember being I mean, I was really worried about this because they said it's unchangeable, it'll cost, you know, whatever to change it and so on. So I snuck back to Earlsfort Terrace, and it was tea time. In those days, there was something called the Professor's Common Room, and even those who were sort of far from the rank of professor would take our tea there, and I found Garret happily reading there. And I went in and I said, Garret, you're going to be really, really upset. You're going to be really angry with me. But something has happened, and well, just have a look. This is going to be the cover of this book, you know, about the Gentle Revolution. The guy said, oh, that's fine. He gave it back like that. I said, you mean you don't mind? No, all publicity is good publicity. He said. You can hear Garret saying it. I mean, it was true. We all know that, of course, you know. But he wasn't going to go through a sort of righteous pretense, you know, that actually this was terrible and so on, but he'd live with it, you know. No, all publicity is good publicity. He said to me, don't you know that, you know? So I said, oh, I was really happy. Anyhow, there we are. The influential lobby problem, obviously it's got this publicity is important and money is important. And both of those are real sources of problem in our democratic politics, because if you get those we elect, so to speak, become dependent on those who support them for campaign funds or in a variety of other ways, then of course the attraction of the quid pro quo, you know, the attraction of giving back, so to speak, a reward for this support is very, very powerful. Again, the United States is of course the outstanding example of this, sadly, because of the particular system and because of judgments like the Citizens United judgment. Maybe we can talk about them afterwards. But it's pretty clear when it comes to financial support of parties and of individuals, there have to be severe restrictions. First of all, on the source of the money. Secondly, on the level of the money. And thirdly, on the stealth with which the money is given. So there have to be very firm disclosure rules. There have to be rules about who can give. For example, corporations being entitled to give means basically CEOs being entitled to, you know, exercise patronage with the money of their companies, because the annual general meeting is not an adequate sort of check on how the CEO is delivering that sort of largesse in general. And there are also serious other problems about corporate donations, but in any case, there have to be limits of that kind. And I would say there ought to be a system of public financing of those in office as well. I know there are problems with that about minority parties and so on, But there are a raft of institutions that can guard against that absolutely central problem for ensuring that people have equal access to influence. Because if the rich, the elite, the supporters have this special access is a zero-sum thing. If some have more of it, others have less of it. Obviously, you can't have equal access to influence if some are capturing, so to speak, those in power. But the same goes through for the media. Again, Ireland, I think, is in a relatively happy position by contrast with many democracies today. I think it's important to have a public broadcaster that is at arm's length from government myself. These are institutional matters will come up, I'm sure, in tomorrow's discussions at various points. But equally, you've got to have a variety of owners and of media controllers in the background in order to have any chance of people having an equal influence on what happens in government rather than influence being captured by those with control over the media. Now, the institutional lesson of all of this really is that, and it's an irony, it's a democratic irony really, that if we're going to give equal access to people in the society, in a system of influence over what happens in government, then one of the things you have to do is depoliticize quite a range of decision making. So, for example, I've talked about three. The first was the sticky majority problem. You depoliticize by constitutionalizing, for example, or by requiring something more than just straightforward parliamentary majority vote in a single assembly for decisions over various policies. All of that is depoliticizing in a sense. But equally, in order to deal with the second problem I mentioned, the party interest problem, you've got to depoliticize with your Electoral Commission, perhaps your central bank, perhaps your sentencing policy commission, though all of these should be only at arm's length from those we elect, not, so to speak, wholly, I would say, isolated from them. And in order to deal with the third problem I mentioned about lobby groups and so on, you've equally got to put in restrictions on who can give money to whom and for what purposes and under, so to speak, what conditions of confidentiality. But I would say, I mean, stressing depoliticization in one way is stressing the wrong thing, because what I immediately have to say is that sort of depoliticization, I've tried to indicate it in the different cases, it'll only work if there's also a very lively community that is prepared to keep an eye through its media, through its discussion groups, through its watchdog groups, through its civic movements, is prepared to keep an eye on exactly what is happening in these depoliticized centres, as well as in the political forum of parliament and government and so on. You have to have depoliticization for sure, but it has to be matched by what I think of as a contestatory politics of people invested in what's happening, reporting what's happening, talking about what's happening, being outraged about what's happening when outrage is appropriate, and doing something about it. Of course, having painted this picture now, I've tried to, what I want to suggest is that it's not wholly unrealistic. In fact, it's really within reach from most of our democratic systems by sketching a system of institutions which has got elections at the centre with a bicameral sort of parliament, and then surrounding it all of these bodies that depoliticize various decisions, that take decisions in their own right. You might say, haven't I created another problem, an unelected agent problem, you might call it? Because after all, I haven't gone through all the possibilities, but remember, my depoliticization is going to involve giving power to a Bureau of Statistics, for example, to a statistician general, to an auditor general, to those who collect economic data and promulgate them. There are going to be a lot of people out there who are going to have power in our system who are not elected. Now, aren't they a difficulty, you might say? Doesn't that mean that they have captured, so to speak, channels of influence and therefore deprive the people as a whole? Well, my view on that is that if we treat these people as, or think of them, and indeed institution of their offices in a corresponding way, if we think of them and treat them as indicative representatives, is the phrase I've used, then we can keep tabs on them as well. Let me just introduce that idea very quickly. Suppose someone says, we want you on such and such a committee because of your interests or the sector of the society, the university that you belong to. And I say, well, I just don't have time, I can't just go on the committee. And they say, well, we'll give you two options. One is you can actually nominate someone to be on the committee and keep tabs on that person. He can report to you. So to speak, he's a responsive representative of you. He's taking instruction from you, right, and acting appropriately. Or they say, or the other thing you do is just pick someone you trust, someone you think who's like you in their values and their priorities and so on, and who is likely, when they vote, to vote as you would have voted had you been there. Now, that second representative, the first representative might be a responsive representative, someone who responds to your instructions. The second representative you might call an indicative representative. He's someone who's indicative of your values and of where you stand. And so someone who can represent you, even though you just nominate him for the office and then leave him be, or her be. It'll be the case that if they stand for the same values, how they vote will be indicative of how you will vote. Now, a lot of people we appoint to public offices, they're appointed as they ought to be by those elected. We appoint to the Bureau of Statistics, to the Auditor General's office, to the Electoral Commission, to the central bank, go through the whole raft of things. A lot of those people, they're appointed with briefs which are publicly known by government. They're appointed in such a way they are at arm's length from Parliament, so they can be called to check. They take their decisions in such a way that the media can keep watching them, that the public as a whole can keep watching them. They've got a vested interest, most of them, in being reappointed, which means they've got to perform in a way that answers to that brief and those public criteria, otherwise there'll be outrage. Of course, the same is true of appointing judges, of course, obviously. To the extent to which all of those things are true of those people, we can expect of them that how they behave will be indicative of how we as a community as a whole, I would say, might expect them or want them to behave. And we could treat them as indicative representatives. So if you put enough constraints in the way of briefs and contestatory sort of checks and review checks and so on people in those bodies, they too can be part of a system that represents us, the people. Side by side with the responsive representatives, you have these indicative representatives. And the system as a whole can be one in which we, at least each of us, has access, insofar as we have access to voting and to the other means of political action, we have access in an equal way to influencing what happens in our public life. Okay, now, I'm taking too long, and I certainly don't want to take any time from our minister in response in his comments. Let me just very briefly say, why might you expect, if you did have this system of institutions, ramped up, as you might say, from what we have at the moment, tightened up, screwed down, working really quite well, why would you expect that it might deliver a direction that is equally acceptable to all? Maybe it's a system of influence to which everyone has equal access, but why would you expect it to deliver a pattern that is equally acceptable to all? And my answer very briefly is this. I think that, well, let me just go straight to an illustration. It's the quickest way of doing it. A historian trained in this university, who taught in this university, later in Cambridge University, and later in the Australian National University, where I got to know him, is Oliver MacDonagh. Wonderful, wonderful historian. He's known in Ireland mainly as the historian of O'Connell and of various other matters, the author of States of Mind, a terrific book. But he's actually more famous in many circles for his history of the administrative state in Britain in the 19th century. And what MacDonagh describes in that long history is the following, that once you get democratic institutions and democratic spirit increasing from about 1830 on, in a society that's literate and a society that's got certain shared values, let's think of it as Victorian England, Christian sort of values, and a society where politicians, because of the democratic element more and more, are pretty responsive to these people. What happens, as MacDonagh describes it, is in that a whole area, a whole range of policy areas, from the conditions of people in the mines, to the conditions of women in various forms of factories, to the employment of children, to the condition of people on ocean-going travel, stuff like that, for example, to the operation even of public offices. In all of these cases, what happens is, he describes it, is you get a cycle. First of all, someone turns up a scandal, like the number of children dying in the factories where they're employed, or the conditions in the mine and the development of various problems and so on. You get a scandal. Then you get outrage in the population as a whole, and then you get a reaction from government. And initially the reaction is always want to set up an inquiry. But it always turns out 5 years later, the problem is still there. So you get another iteration of the cycle. scandal, outrage, reaction. And again, 5 years later, problem's still there, but you get another iteration. And after a series of iterations of this cycle, you get policy really slowly change, but change quite dramatically. So the policy over the mines, over children, over women, in a whole range of areas that he describes, shifts in a way that answers, well, I would say answers to standards that are taken for granted amongst people and endorsed in public amongst people in the population at large, who know what cruelty is, who know what suffering is, who have absolutely shared view as to how it's appropriate to treat people in places of employment and so on. And what happens is, over this long haul, these standards get impressed on government. Particular government policies are always the result of a particular vote in the House of Commons, for example, or a particular decision by someone in a bureaucracy. There's an element of chance there. But over the long haul, the fact that people are more democratically engaged impresses a sort of pattern or shape of standard satisfaction of community standards in the development of government. Now, I think of the main contribution of democracy is this, that working properly with centres of discussion, with engagement on the part of a citizenry involved in government, with a system of government that's not captured in the various ways it can be captured, and that is forced to be responsive to what's emerging amongst the people. In that sort of situation, there's a slow democracy and a fast democracy. The fast democracy is what we see in the day-to-day, where there appears to be a random movement of one group wins out, another group wins out, and so on in policy making. But the idea is that over the long run, in a sort of slow democracy, there ought to be, if the system is working right, an imposition on government of the sorts of standards that almost everyone accepts. Now, the very striking thing is that in the institutions I described, you're going to have many centres of discussion and exchange and argument and banter of a political kind. But in these institutions, as indeed is the case for many of our institutions, invariably when people argue with one another, they have to argue from considerations that they take it almost everyone will see as relevant. So, for example, the prosperity of the country, or the fact that people are treated as equals. There are all sorts of standards which are taken for granted that emerge in a society of democratic decision-making. So, for example, I've mentioned here, no society, no democratic society on earth would think that it's okay for the government to do nothing about, say, a terrible flood that has occurred in a particular area that's made people homeless or whatever. Everyone accepts a standard under which that's government's responsibility. No one will accept, hopefully, a standard according to which some group in the society are basically second-rate citizens and not deserving of the same treatment. That's what's so completely horrendous about anti-Semitism or any oppression of a minority in a political system. Or, for example, on matters of, we all accept that no one should be subject to conflict of interest and that those in public office should be subject to constraints that restrict the conflicts of interest to which they're subject. A whole range of things. All of us believe that religion should be kept out of politics. In general, I would say that's been an emerging pattern in most democracies that have been active over a longer period, because it's the only way in which people can see one another as equals. And these standards, as they emerge, can get impressed on government over the long haul. And that, I think, is what democracy is about. Okay, the model I've described, notice, is a model of democracy under which it's not the case that everything, it's local elections, higher elections, elections. It's not just a system of elections, turtles the whole way down, elections the whole way down, as you might say. It's a system of democracy under which you've got many elements, from the courts to the bureaucracy to the central bank to the Electoral Commission to the various modes of contestation available to people via watchdog bodies, via civic movements. And it's in the turbulence and the turmoil of this interaction where it's properly instituted in the manner I've tried to sort of gesture at. It's in that you will get the possibility of the people really sharing equally in a system of control that delivers results that at least are constrained by standards they all share, standards that they are all ready to invoke in this debate. And to that extent, it's a system, ideally it would be a system of equally accessible influence that would deliver an equally acceptable direction. Of course, that model is the older model of a mixed constitution and a contestatory citizenry that's long been part of the Republican tradition, right back to Rome, but through the Renaissance, through the 17th and 18th centuries, and of course in Ireland, in the Republican thought of, say, someone like Wolfe Tone, where it's so important that you don't have one group capturing, you don't even have a majority capturing government. You've got a government that's responsive to different sectors where power is articulated in these very different channels, in a very complex sort of organism of government. But I better stop at that. I've gone on too long already. Thank you very much for the attention.